Now for our other featured reader today, Sabena Stark. I have known Sabena as a local writer and poet for quite a few years now. I was fortunate enough to have had the opportunity to videotape her reading at the Eugene Public Library back in 2012 as part of the wonderful author's presentation of the anthology Before There Is Nowhere to Stand, Palestine, Israel, Poets Respond to the Struggle. Of course, I asked Sabena to send me a short bio as well, and her bio reads, Sabena Stark writes poetry, prose, and music. She has been a single mother, a composer, a student and performer of West African and Middle Eastern percussion, a klezmer musician, a teacher of music theory and jazz piano, a waitress, a bookkeeper, finance director of several nonprofit community agencies, an interfaith hospital chaplain, leader of singing and meditation groups for people with cancer and other chronic illnesses, trainer of many puppies and kittens, and a child of immigrants. Her work has been published in a number of literary magazines, including Georgetown Review and Bridges Journal. Her poem, High Holy Days, appears in the anthology Before There Was Nowhere to Stand, Palestine, Israel, Poets Respond to the Struggle, Lost Horse Press, 2012. Her song, Learning How to Fly, Sony Epic, was recorded by Tuck and Patty and is performed around the world. Sabena is a graduate of the UO School of Journalism and Communications Literary Nonfiction Program and UC Berkeley School of Music. Her book in progress received the Oregon Literary Arts Fellowship. She lives and writes in Eugene, Oregon. Please welcome Sabena Stark.
Hi folks, thank you Stephen and Charles and everyone who is so amazingly supportive of the writers in our community. I'm going to read two stories. I'll save my poems for the end cap on this event. I'm going to read a piece of my memoir project, and then I'm going to read a piece of fiction. So Passover, the holiday Passover is starting on Friday night of this week, and so that's one of the reasons I chose this piece. It's about a Seder from my childhood. And for those of you who don't know, for the last 3,000 years, Jewish families and their friends get together to celebrate the exodus of the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt. And the word Seder means order. There's an order that is followed all over the world in every country of the globe. And it's a time to reflect on liberation, both personal and for the world. There's a book that's used called the Haggadah, so I'm just trying to fill you in on the words you're going to hear in this story, and it means the telling. This is a story of a Passover Seder from my childhood. One of us was going to get smacked. My sister Susie and I knew it and were kicking each other under the table to keep from laughing because what else could we do? My father stood, his yarmulke resting on the top of his head as he chanted and raced through the Hebrew text of the 49-page Rabbi Nathan Goldberg Passover Haggadah. He glared down at us periodically without missing a word, with a look that said, "If you touch any of that food before I finish, you'll be sorry." It was 6:30 on the eve of Passover. We were seated in our apartment kitchen where the table stood just a few feet from the stove. The light of the brilliant first full moon of spring would soon pour in through the kitchen window. My mother was moving quickly, her cotton apron wrapped around her house dress. She had already set down bowls in front of us filled with chicken soup, its rich broth buoying up islands of matzo balls and shimmering sweet onion. 2 white candles glowed in their holders in the center of the table. "Eat before it gets cold," she said. My mother had spent the day preparing our dinner and the appropriate ceremonial foods. The mound of charosis, made of hand-chopped walnuts and apples soaked in sweet grape wine, sat untouched in the serving dish. Beside it was a plate of still warm gefilte fish, each piece topped with its own yarmulke of cooked sliced carrot. She had tucked 3 big squares of salted matzah into their 3-tiered satin cover. On the table in front of my father sat the designated Seder plate, displaying the other symbolic foods: a roasted lamb shank bone, an egg, a sprig of parsley, the pungent horseradish, and a dollop of the apple and nut mixture. The simmering pot of chicken soup beckoned from the stove, and the luscious scents from the bowls and plates of food before us interfered with any other thoughts. We were hungry, and the aromas were dizzying. My sister, at almost 11 years old, was quiet, planned her words and actions carefully. She was my primary caretaker from the time of my infancy, and her large hazel eyes drank in the world with the seriousness of someone in charge. My father adored and in many ways counted on my sister. In contrast, I was intrepid, talkative, and trusting. For the 5 years following my sister's birth, my father had hoped for a son, and after the war, a replacement child for his little boy, whose life, along with the life of his first young wife, was stolen by one of the mobile Nazi killing units. But I was a second girl, the only other child he would get. As the youngest member of the household, it was my job to intone the 4 kashas, or 4 questions, early in the Seder, soon after we blessed and drank the first of 4 required glasses of wine. And so I began in my thin, childish soprano to sing out the first inquiry. Ma neshana halayla hazeh mikol haleilot. Why is this night different from all other nights? My sister read along the Haggadah in case I made a mistake, so she could have the pleasure of correcting me. The 4 questions were printed and typed twice the size of the other texts in the Haggadah, in bold, simply shaped Hebrew letters meant for children to read. Some of the lines were more difficult to sing. Shebechol halelot anu ochlin. The longer phrases had to be squeezed into the same melodic line as the short ones, and they were a bit of a tongue twister, but I had practiced. When the final words squeaked out of my lips, halayla hazeh kulanu mesubin, I was sure I had aptly fulfilled the task. Fortunately, my mother was facing the kitchen counter and didn't interrupt my performance. She had as much patience for my singing as she had for my father's. Her focus remained on delivering our dinner. She filled the bowl with glistening ground potato from the roasting pan and ferried it to the table. When I was done singing, my father kissed the top of my head and then launched into the answer, the Hebrew liturgy of the Exodus story, our escape from slavery to freedom. But as soon as he opened his mouth, my mother looked over her shoulder and confronted my sister and me again. What are you two waiting for? Everything's getting spoiled. My father continued to murmur the rolling passages of Hebrew as we sat quietly, staring at the fragrant offerings in front of us. The roast chicken, meanwhile, had been cooling on a serving dish on the counter. My mother started cutting it up and placing pieces on our plates. Hurry up, finish already, she fired at my father, but he wouldn't stop. He rocked subtly as he stood and chanted with greater intensity. He flashed an angry look in her direction between the words. I was getting nervous, picked up my spoon, but didn't touch the food. My father frowned. I started to giggle, but my sister stopped me with a pinch. My mother turned to my sister and me. Enough, what are you two smiling about? Under the table, I swung my leg to the side and kicked my sister as hard as I could, hoping she would say something to placate my parents. But she didn't say a word. Instead, she kicked me back. I stifled my reaction to avoid drawing more attention from them to us. It was an April night, and invariably there were drunks shouting from downstairs outside the bar at the base of our building. My father kept chanting from the Haggadah louder and faster, page after page. When it was time to recite the blessing over the next serving of wine, he raised his adult wine glass, and we raised our child-sized ones. sipping at the fiery sweet liquid. He then set his glass down and dipped his pinky into the remaining wine to extract one drop at a time as he called out the 10 plagues that befell the Egyptians to acknowledge their suffering. Blood, frogs, vermin, beasts, cattle disease, boils, hail, locust, darkness, and the worst and final plague, the slaying of the firstborn. We followed along, dripping wine onto our plates and surreptitiously licking the drops from our fingers. Now he chanted the rabbinical arguments about the meaning of the plagues and the liberation of the Israelites. How thankful we must be to God. Dayenu, if only God had liberated us, it would have been enough. It would have been enough for my mother if the Seder had ended here. But it was time to taste the bitter herbs and matzah and cry the tears of slavery. My father held up a small bowl filled with pungent horseradish and chanted in Hebrew, "These bitter herbs which we eat, what is their meaning? They are eaten to recall that the Egyptians embittered the lives of our forefathers in Egypt, as it is written, and they embittered their lives with hard labor, with mortar and bricks, with every kind of work in the fields. All the work which they made them do was rigorous," all throughout my mother's protests. Finally, the crescendo of my mother's frustration reached its peak and her voice rose. "Are you mocking me? The food is destroyed. Eat your dinner." I looked up at my father, who was still praying in earnest, and my mother, who was hovering over us, glaring at the food on our plates that we didn't dare eat. A laugh came bursting out of my mouth, and here came the smack. My mother ran out of patience with my father, with God, with Rabbi Nathan Goldberg's overlong Haggadah, and especially with her 2 daughters. Between my sister and me, the one whose face was closest to her would be the first recipient of her fury. It didn't matter which one. Her small, hot palm would land somewhere between my neck and my forehead if she was looking. If she wasn't, it could arrive anywhere on my body. This evening, it was my small cheek and left eye which received her blow. The sting was shocking, even though I expected it, and I let out a yell. My father, still chanting, paused long enough to shove my mother out of the way. And then it began. Happy Passover. She threw a serving spoon at him, along with several curses, and in return, he struck her, and she landed on the floor crying and sobbing. "See what he does to me." Susie froze, and I shrieked. I hoped that if I cried loud enough, they would stop fighting, but they didn't. The invectives came flying, and despite my mother's rage, she couldn't overpower my father. She lunged at him, but he propelled her across the room with one short, muscular arm. "Meshuggah Rosa, sit down." He invoked the name of my mother's Aunt Rosa, who had died of a brain tumor soon after arriving in New York with my parents in 1946. Rosa had gone crazy, Meshuggah, before the cancer took her life. With Rosa's spirit in the room, my mother's Yiddish curses began. "Your face should burn in hell. You've ruined my life," she answered back. "What do I need you for? You destroyed me. You take your stupid Passover and kill yourself with it." She grabbed a heavy plate from the counter and flung it at him. The dish missed his head by inches and shattered on the linoleum floor. He stepped around the table and with his wide hand slapped her across the face. "Quiet, you crazy woman. You don't know what you're saying." I know plenty," she screamed at him. "I know everything." Then she collapsed, whimpering into her hands. Though she didn't comprehend more than a few words of the Hebrew text, the meaning and the irony of the Exodus story was not lost on her. Unlike my father, she couldn't forgive God for the cruelty and indifference she had suffered. My mother went through the motions of observance of this holiday, but she refused to waste her gratitude on a heartless ruler of the universe. My father's prayers had only amplified her helplessness. Seeing them fight like that, and more than anything else, seeing my mother so vulnerable and humiliated was terrifying. I wanted to protect her, but it would have been easier to protect an injured leopard. My desire to contain my parents' outburst was overwhelming. I could feel the open rage between them strangling me from the inside. like a rope twisting and tightening around my guts. If only I could anticipate the forces that set their outbursts in motion to divert them before they came into full blossom. I knew without understanding that the fight was not about dinner getting cold. It was about something else, something dreadful and more potent, something for now unspoken. If through some miracle we could have postponed the eruption until my mother downed at least 2 of the obligatory 4 glasses of wine, we might have enjoyed a halfway peaceful night. We could count on the wine to make my mother sleepy and send her to bed. But the way my parents expressed their inner lives, like the springtime weather and the drunks on the street below, was unpredictable. And yet, when the outburst ended, we settled into a state of equanimity. Even as a small child, I knew how to adapt by blotting out the bad things I had only just experienced. Soon the shock of disruption dissipated. The first half of the Seder was complete, and it was time for the meal. My mother's efforts would not be wasted. We had a feast to consume and receive comfort from. The emotions had been wrung out of all of us. For the rest of the evening, a type of deep peace settled in. Once we began to eat, we relaxed into the real Seder, the one that made sense, the one that I loved and wanted to remember, the one that my father intended for us. My father had found his way back to the God of his childhood, back to the faith that sustained him. Abundant tears and rage and grief would often flood his life, but not tonight. This night was a celebration, a new family, a sustaining ritual, the joy of living. As we ate, my father recounted stories leading up to and following the Exodus. No longer reading from the Hebrew Haggadah, he told these tales in Yiddish, dotted with fragments of English, the interwoven language we spoke at home and that I understood. My father seemed to know all the principal characters of these stories as if they had been his neighbors. He could list the patrilineal lineage of every human in the Hebrew tribe, from Adam to Sandy Koufax. There was more wine and lots of sweets, Passover sponge cake and coconut macaroons and brightly colored fruit jellies. At the appointed time, I swung open the apartment door to welcome in the prophet Eliyahu and looked to see if he had sipped at his glass of deliciously sweet Mogen David wine, now sitting on the wine-stained tablecloth. There was no expectation of going to sleep at a preordained hour, so the evening could roll on at its own pace. The wine took its effect quickly for my mother. She trundled off to bed early, leaving my sister and me to soak up the tales and sing the Passover songs that my father had shared and sung since his childhood. The screaming curses, the slaps, the rope coiled around my guts, all receded to the distant land of memory when at last, sated with scrumptious food and melodies and stories, I too wandered off to bed. So this is a piece of fiction. I don't know why, but this character, Mrs. Bipp, showed up and she just started telling me her story. So, and she'd leave me a sentence at a time, which was really frustrating because her story kind of unraveled over several months. Just for a reference, Marcel Marceau, the famous mime, who was also a Holocaust survivor, his character was named Bipp. And so it kind of hit me as sort of the power of what's unspoken. Mrs. Bipp pushed her shopping cart and turned so the back of her woolen coat faced the store camera. It was only a 3-pack of ladies' underwear, good enough. And then in the hair products aisle, past a young mother trying impossibly to console her red-faced toddler, Mrs. Bipp picked up a slender bottle of shampoo, the size and shape of the package having dictated her choice. The bottle fit smoothly into her large coat pocket. She resumed shopping and put 2 cans of noodle soup on sale, 2 for $1, in the top compartment of her cart. And from eye level on the adjacent shelf, threw in a box of Ritz crackers, also on sale. She placed a carton of eggs in the upper basket, poked each egg to be sure that none of them were cracked, and on top of the carton, a single cube of unsalted butter from the dairy case, where the sharp scent of bleach wafted up and lingered in her nostrils. Then she rolled her cart toward the front of the store. On the way to the checkout line, she slipped a Hershey's milk chocolate bar into her other coat pocket, even though she knew eating it would give her a stomachache. "Nice earrings," Mrs. Bipp said to the checker, handing over a 10. Mrs. Bipp always paid cash. She had retired from her job as a secretary in a law office almost 20 years earlier and found it was easier to keep track of her money when she handled real dollars. "Oh, thank you, they're a gift from my daughter." When she got her change, she dropped a quarter into the can for the Make-A-Wish Foundation. It was raining outside. The air bit her cheeks as she crossed the parking lot with her bag of groceries. The checker came running up from behind, hugging a maroon faux leather purse against her check before Mrs. Bipp reached her car. "Mrs. Bipp, you left your wallet." "Thank you, dear. Good thing my head's screwed on." Mrs. Bipp continued, head forward and slightly down against the rain, along the middle of the lot looking for her car. She had parked the car facing the wrong way to make it easier to find. Mrs. Bipp had an uneasy sense that there was something she forgot to pick up, but she drove home anyway. Mrs. Bipp's second-story apartment had an airy feel with kitchen windows that faced east. Once inside, she kicked off her shoes, removed the pack of underwear, chocolate bar, and bottle of shampoo from her coat pockets, set the eggs and butter into the refrigerator, and placed the cans of soup and box of Ritz crackers in the cupboard. Then in her small bathroom, she hung up her wet coat on a hanger over the shower rod and toweled off her hair and face slowly like a cat. She began to sing as she entered the spare living room and stopped abruptly when Mrs. Schreiber, sitting quietly on the couch, came into focus. "Fanya, how long have you been here?" Mrs. Bipp asked. "Since before you left to get milk for our tea?" "Our tea, of course. Well, the rain is terrible. I can't go out again. Let's have ginger ale with Italian syrup, a treat." She returned to her kitchen and took out a tall bottle of raspberry syrup from the shelf. "Oh, did you bring these?" Mrs. Bipp asked, opening a white bag, a bakery bag sitting on the counter. The bag contained a dozen butter cookies with sugared red cherries in the center. They smell delicious. "Yes, this morning," Mrs. Schreiber said, "like you asked me, don't you remember?" Must have slipped my mind. She remembered just then that Mrs. Schreiber had asked her for help composing a will. It was a little job she could take on to earn a few extra bucks. Mrs. Bipp loaded a plate with the butter cookies in a neatly layered circle as intermittent gusts of wind shook the window panes against their aging moldings and dried putty. Meanwhile, Mrs. Schreiber set her paperwork on the coffee table in the living room. She said across the room to Mrs. Bipp, "Bella, I know you're doing me a favor and I appreciate it. How long do you think it'll take? I've never done this before." Mrs. Bipp came out of the kitchen carrying a tray with 2 pink ginger ales and tall soda glasses and the plate of cookies in the middle. She said, not long, maybe half an hour. It depends on how many decisions you still need to make." Mrs. Bipp looked up at the brass wall clock. 25 minutes past 10. "I have a hair appointment at noon," she thought, "plenty of time." "I've made my decisions," Mrs. Schreiber said. "I just need help with the language and your legal expertise." The rings on Mrs. Schreiber's fingers had lately become loose and heavy. "Fanya, it's always better for everyone concerned to get things in writing ahead of time. I'm happy to help you." Mrs. Schreiber took a deep breath and then said, "There isn't much money, but that's not the most important thing." Mrs. Bipp reached across the coffee table and took up the paperwork, mindful to keep the pages in order as she read the first page. "Yes, of sound mind. That's good," she continued aloud. The following items, along with the value of my savings and checking accounts, shall become the sole property of Miss Amelia Daisy Becker. Mrs. Schreiber interrupted. There's no one in my life who would benefit more from receiving my assets, and she won't appreciate it now, not for several years, but when the time comes, when she's ready, I think she will. Mrs. Bibb continued reading. 5 novels in progress, including one with multiple alternate introductions, 16 unpublished stories, 10 without endings, 4 without middles, unpublished poetry, 82 rhymed, 56 freestyle, including 24 handwritten, 15 sonnets English, 3 pantoums, 106 haiku, 1 prose poem draft. She stopped briefly to glance at Mrs. Schreiber, whose eyebrows were raised in happy anticipation, before continuing. Translations of 12 Ukrainian recipes, includes conversion of metric to U.S. measure, 25 short unpublished essays on various topics, list of titles enclosed. Mrs. Bibb took a long sip of her ginger ale. She was losing track of the conversation. What's a pantoum? She wondered. Fortunately, Mrs. Schreiber brought her back to the subject at hand. Miss Amelia Becker will surely enjoy this collection when the time comes. Miss Amelia Becker, is she related to you? She's not related. She's the granddaughter of a woman in my writing group. I'm not a very good writer, I hate to say. Oh, the writer in your group? A memoirist with a voice like a bagpipe, always returning to that drone, that constant drone. And she introduced you to her granddaughter, Amelia. Well, yes, I met her several times this year during our monthly critique sessions. Amelia often joins us in the living room where we congregate. I believe our discussions about literature and the craft of writing piqued her interest. I sensed that she could grow up to become a skilled linguist or a writer herself. Her ability to respond to the subtleties of language and syntax seem extraordinary for her young age. And of course, her vocabulary is already rich with a sense of nuance and tone. She seems to sing when she talks. How old is Amelia? She celebrated her 5th birthday last June. Mrs. Bibb squinted at Mrs. Schreiber, searching for something in her face that maybe she hadn't noticed before. This will take longer than I expected, she thought. And what about Amelia's mother? Is she part of the group too? Do you have contact with her? Well, no, her mother's not a writer. I mean, she comes and goes. I think she works. A single mother, yes. Mrs. Bibb scanned the paperwork again. These are the assets, right? I'm supposed to write the will, find 2 witnesses, and get it notarized. It occurred to her that if she charged Mrs. Schreiber a fee for a will that couldn't legally be carried out, there might be repercussions. Then, as if a voice from the past floated into the present, she was sitting at her work desk in a pantsuit and flats, speaking with one of the young lawyers. She said to Mrs. Schreiber, "It sounds like you'll want to establish a trust for the child as far as the funds are concerned. Are there any other assets?" "Just one other," Mrs. Schreiber said, a sense of regret in her voice. "I have a small dog. I'm afraid he's going to outlive me, and I want to know he'll be cared for. I can attach a photograph of him and his license to the final copy, if you recommend it." "Yes, that's a good idea. And I have a 4-foot-long love seat that he sleeps on. I want to include that, with my dog, I mean." "And to whom will you leave the dog? And the love seat," Mrs. Schreiber added. "Yes, and the love seat." "My checker at Savers Market, where I do my shopping." "Bonnie. She's normally at the cash register nearest the door next to the flowers and plants section, where it's always drafty. I don't know why they put her there. Every time the door opens, there's a rush of cold wind. She wears a jacket inside all winter. She's the assistant manager. It says so on her jacket." "Fanya," Mrs. Bibb said in a more serious tone, "does Bonnie know your dog?" "Oh, no, I'm not allowed to bring Mitzi into the store, but we always talk about our families. I mean, she talks about her daughter and her son. They're both married, and her husband, the work they're doing on the house. She's planning to retire soon," she said. Does she have a dog? I don't know. She didn't say. A cat, I think, Mrs. Schreiber picked up a butter cookie and bit it in half, carefully wiping the crumbs from her lips with the back of her hand. Have you spoken with Bonnie about this, about the dog? Sure, I talk with her nearly every day. She knows all about Mitzi. Mrs. Bipp could feel her face heating up. Time to wrap things up, she thought. So then, your monetary assets, your collected writings, your dog Mitzi, and the love seat. Is there anything else? No, but yes, I want to name a medical power of attorney in case something goes haywire. Haywire? Do you have a relative or a close friend who you trust to assume that role? Well, no relatives, said Mrs. Schreiber. My husband died 15 years ago, as you know, and no sisters or brothers. I'm an only child. My children live across the country. I hardly ever hear from them. I don't trust my kids, not for this, I mean. Oh? I was hoping you would agree to be my medical power of attorney. Healthcare proxy, I think it's called. Mrs. Bipp sat silently for a moment. She didn't want to offend Mrs. Schreiber, but she didn't have the stomach for illness and hospitals and such. She didn't even like hospital shows on TV. It looked so claustrophobic, and this was getting too personal. Fanya, you're talking about a living will. That's another type of conversation, another document. I'm honored that you asked me, but we don't know each other that well. I'm not sure I would be an appropriate... Before she could continue, Mrs. Schreiber said, Bella, I believe I'm a very good judge of character. I sense that you would be fearless in challenging situations, fearless and steady. I'm flattered you think so, Mrs. Bipp replied. Bonnie at Savers Market said so too. When I mentioned that you were going to help me with my estate, she recognized your name. She called you fearless and steady. Do you know her very well? The break room at Savers Family Market, upstairs and much warmer than the main floor, is lit with a fluorescent overhead light. The employee lockers installed 25 years ago way down one end of the room. A few plastic chairs ring the table in the center where there's an open package of Entenmann's pastries and a half-empty bottle of Diet Pepsi. The broken refrigerator and microwave both need cleaning. The Checkers, meat counter, deli, and produce staff rarely use the room. They take their breaks sitting in their cars, or if the weather is good, resting on plastic benches outside behind the building where they can smoke cigarettes and talk on their phones. Adjoining the break room is the manager's office, a small closet-sized space crammed full with an old padded office chair, a wooden desk with locking drawers, and a television that broadcasts the video feed from the store cameras. Bonnie sometimes takes her breaks sitting at that wooden desk, watching the television. It's part of her job to review the footage from the day before. Several cameras are running, each on its own channel. Most of the cameras are trained on the Checkers at their registers, but several record shoppers walking the aisles. She can speed through the footage, and as it switches channels, follow a customer from one part of the supermarket to another. Her store, like all of them, has its regular shoplifters. Her favorite, hands down, is Mrs. Bipp.
Thank you, Sabena. Let's give Sabena another hand. Wonderful reading today. Okay, so let's take a quick break. We're running a little long, so let's hold it to about 5 minutes if we can, and we'll come back with the open mic. We got a lot of people want to read today, so it should be pretty exciting. Thanks.